I'm Gary Lindsay, and I was teaching journalism and advising the Torch newspaper at Cedar Rapids Kennedy High School. Well, I just recently retired as the journalism advisor at Kennedy High School after 40 years. I retired a year and a half ago. I'm now mentoring teachers in Iowa, and I can still serve on the JEA board. Well, I think I was in my second year of advising. So I had taken a seminar on journalism law, actually from Mark Goodman, actually. And I thought I understood the law very well because we were under the Tinker standard, and I understood the exceptions to what students could do and what they could not do. And I thought I understood that really well. And then, so when the Hazelwood ruling came down, I was shocked. And that really kind of turned the world upside down for me, because instead of knowing pretty clearly what students could and could not do, they came down with a ruling that basically said educational standards will determine that, and the principal could help determine that. And that made it really confusing for us for a while. And so immediately we began working to try to get that overturned in Iowa. Not so much in our school, but in a sister school at Jefferson High School. The day of the ruling, the principal came out and said, now we can start doing something about what kids write on their t-shirts. Now we can do something about student free speech, and we weren't able to do that before. So immediately the principal announced an intention to crack down on student free expression. And he saw that the Hazelwood ruling was really licensed to do that. And we did begin to see then a lot of talk about restrictions on what students wore in the classroom, what they wore in school. And I think we began to see much more prior review, an impetus for prior review. I did not experience that myself. It was a really interesting experience. Basically what we did with that is we started to working with Richard Varn, who is a representative in Iowa. And he introduced legislation to basically bring us back to the Tinker standard for publications. And it was interesting. We learned a lot about how laws are made. We worked with a lot of people in our state association. And basically, we were successful very quickly, actually, successful getting that law passed. I think it was the first one to overturn the Hazelwood ruling and take us back to the Tinker standard in Iowa. One specific thing that it's done is that it has really clouded what the Iowa law is in the minds of many people. There was a time where I had a conflict with my principal, and she asked for an opinion from an attorney friend of hers who worked with the Iowa School Board, and that attorney was not aware that there was an Iowa law that gave students the right of free expression, and believed that the Hazelwood law covered us in Iowa. So I think it created a lot of national disbelief, or a national perception that the law was other than what it really was. In Iowa, I would say not so much. In Iowa, it's very specific about the students having the right to free expression. They can print anything that's not libelous, obscene, incites to riot, or is obviously a threat to national security, but also the idea of significant disruption of the school environment. And that's a pretty high threshold to be able to pass in order to be able to disrupt a student publication. So I don't think in Iowa particularly it does. One of the problems right now, I think, that we're really getting into in free expression for students is what they do on Facebook, what they do online, and that's a huge area. And I think there are real challenges in that area.
I am Janet Barker-Levin. In 1988, I was the advisor for the correspondent newspaper at John Hersey High School in Arlington Heights, Illinois, and that is my current job also. Embarrassingly enough, I got a phone call from the local press, and the decision had come down while I was teaching, and I didn't know what the decision was. But the local press was on the phone, and they wanted my reaction to it. There was no internet in those days. There was no TV in my room. I had no way of knowing what it was, but I was too silly to say, I don't know what it is. Anyway, they asked me, they said, what is your reaction? And I thought, well, regardless of what the answer is, I'm going to answer it so it works for my benefit. And I said, I am certain that this ruling will have no impact on me because I'm positive the administrators in my district have enough faith in their newspaper advisors and their students that they won't change a thing. Kind of worked out for my benefit because that is actually what happened. Probably not that day, but I think like a week later, my principal came to me. He was not a fan of me or the correspondent, often hated things we wrote about. But he came to me and he said, we're not going to change a thing. We're going to go on the way we always have. So that's kind of how it ends. Well, not ends. I've had 4 other principals since then. That's always the first question my kids do when they announce who the new principal is. They'll call them up, start an interview, and that's their first question. What's your stance on prior review? So, and I've never had a problem, although it's definitely always in the back of our mind. Yeah, well, there were times I would get these notes all the time from him and it would say, see me, and I'd have to drop by. I would not know what he was mad about at the time. He loved that. That was my 3rd year at Hersey. I was tenured, but I was also the low person on the totem pole. So anytime he would be like, oh, I'm tired of this, he could have riffed me and I could have easily gone without the thought of that's about censorship. He did not like a lot of the controversial stories that my students wrote. He often would just give me dirty looks in the hallway. He didn't like what I did. But he had gotten into this pattern when parents or someone called about what was in the newspaper and saying, well, that crazy lady lets those kids do whatever they want. And he kind of liked that out, I think is what happened. And he didn't really want to be the censorer. He didn't want to do all that work. So he continued to say, I can't censor the paper. We don't work that way here. And that's kind of the way I think it went. He's still alive today. I see him every once in a while. We get along. But I think that was really his way of thinking, oh, I don't really want this power. I've had, like I said, 4 new principals. I've had 4 new superintendents. There's been threats of prior review. There's been prior review in there's 6 high schools in my district. There's been some prior review going on. So yeah, I've been scared a lot. And you know, you just have to get kids ready. You just have to say, look, this is the way we're running it now. But any given time, somebody might come in here and say, that's not the way you're giving it. And we're going to have to be prepared to defend that at any given time. And so, yeah, there's been times where my kids have talked the principal out of trying to censor things. There's been some ugly incidents. And we pretty much have just tried to stay firm and battle it within the district so it doesn't get ugly. People are just different. You know, I'm always appalled when kids come to me and they will go, how come you let those kids put that in the paper? And I was like, people didn't ask me those questions in the 80s. They just would say, we can do anything we want. So now when students say that to me, I think, I don't let them do anything. They have a right to do that. And sometimes I don't love what's in the paper, but that's not my business to determine that. And they're often shocked that I believe that way. They're just a completely different group of people. They're used to people telling them they don't have rights and not investigating and knowing their rights. But I always teach a unit in my beginning journalism class about the law and the history of it. And now in my 32nd year of advising, I have a story to go with every part of that I personally experienced. And when kids get that, they're like, wow, that's a lot of stories and a lot of more work on my part than they thought I was willing to do. And they're always astounded that I'm kind of more on their side, because I'm, you know, to them I'm an older woman who's like, why would she care about our rights? So it's odd. But yeah, there's always this in the back of the head, like, wow, this might be the one that's going to get us in big trouble. And honestly, I've always say this to my kids too. I can't predict what's going to make people angry. I'm always wrong. Like, you know, I'll get called down to the principal's office and I'll say, oh, I know it's on that front page story. And then it's about something else and I'm like, really? That's what it's about? I cannot predict what upsets people. Yeah, actually, before I came to Hersey, I was taught in Gary, Indiana, and my principal did ask to see the paper ahead of time. So this was prior to Hazelwood, so I knew the law, but I was a new teacher, I wasn't tenured. He said, I'd like to see the paper ahead of time. And I actually went into him and I said, you're my principal, you're asking to see the paper, I will let you see it. I just want you to know it's not over here. We're going to go further in this investigation. My students will be seeking Student Press Law Center help. And so he said to me, you mean you won't let me see it? And I said, no, you're my principal. I'll follow through with this. But it's not going to end here with you just reading it from now on. We're going to check into that. And he said, why should I give into that? And I said, well, what's my job then? Like, if you're going to tell them what goes in and what doesn't go in, what am I supposed to be doing? My students will have no respect for me if that's the deal. And he came back to me later with that out. I don't want your students to not have respect for you, so we won't censor the paper. But I know in the back of his mind, I had kind of let that thread out there that it's not ending here. And I guess that's also my point now. I have so many former students who are journalists. I have so many friends in the local media around where I am. I have powerful Chicago media that if I were censored, meaning my students, I have a big enough name that I would make it ugly, or my students would make it ugly. I would just tell them where to go. But I don't think anybody would think they could just come in and censor us without us going there. And really, that would be my point to a new advisor. You're not alone. There's people there to help you. So don't just give in because you're worried. Talk to people, get people to talk for you. And then my other thing is, my students do the talking. I don't ever go in and talk to the principal that way. And usually principals would say things to me they'd never say to a kid, because a kid's going to go home and tell his parents. And so that's the difference. And so I always send my kids in, and I just say, stay firm, do your best. That's all you can do.
My name is Nick Ferentinos, and I was the advisor to the Epitaph, the newspaper at Homestead High School in Cupertino, California. I've been advisor since 1976 and had never experienced any kind of censorship whatsoever in the school. Had a long history of free expression. It was never really an issue for us that we would ever be censored. On January 13th, 1988, when I got to school, one of my colleagues told me that the Supreme Court had just ruled in the Hazelwood ruling. He knew about it because we had run a spread earlier in the year on the upcoming ruling, knowing that it would affect the student press. So we had run quite a bit of coverage on it already. And so I stopped by the principal's office on my way to my classroom, told him essentially, you won't believe what the Supreme Court did today. And it gave principals more right to censor than ever before. And I left it at that and went back to my classroom, where the phone was ringing off the hook. I was getting phone calls from virtually every Bay Area media outlet to get my reaction to the ruling. By that point, I had some prominence in the Bay Area, so they were looking for comments about the ruling. So just before I taught my beginning journalism class, I got a call from the local paper, the San Jose Mercury News. And the reporter, Dan Nicasso, wanted to interview me, and I said, you know, I'm just about to start my class. Could you call me after class, and I can give you a lengthy interview if you need it at that time. So I taught the class, and in through the door walks the principal, and I thought to myself naively, oh, this is great. The principal's coming to support us, to express his strong views that the campus ought to remain free of any kind of encumbrance. And he said, you know, that story that your students are preparing about a boy on campus who was HIV, I want you to take that story out of the newspaper and put it on the shelf, was his words. And at that point, my editor-in-chief, who was in the room, asked the principal, can I take that story off the shelf and put it in my newspaper if I choose to? And he said, I'm telling you that you're to remove that story and not run it. And so when Nicasso called me afterwards, he asked me, could this ever happen at Homestead? And I said, it just did. And he put the story on the wire after he confirmed it with the principal, and the story went wide. I mean, the story went viral at that particular point. And so if I thought I was getting phone calls before, the campus was soon inundated with every Bay Area media outlet around. And we were essentially the first story of any prominence to get national consideration in effect of the Hazelwood ruling. So it was a pretty wild time for us. The Hazelwood ruling has had an enormous impact on the school press, and it was one that we all cautioned about at the time. We said, as bad as this ruling is, our state now had protection, and that was the reason that we were able to run the story, because we had a state law protecting us. And other states adopted protection as well, 7 of us now. But it's had a chilling effect on the student press. And I hear it from virtually every student audience I talk to, is that we can't run that kind of a story. And we're afraid to run that kind of a story. And that's probably the most insidious impact the Hazelwood ruling has had. 25 years later, there are students now who lack the courage and the bravery that we used to see commonly in the student press in the 80s and 90s after the Tinker ruling, which essentially, I think, opened the door to a real golden era of student journalism. And since the Hazelwood ruling, we don't see as many of the kinds of courageous journalism, the kind of journalism that we used to see. And that's most worrisome, I think, that it continues down to this present day, even in states like California, where I hear from students that we can't run that story when I explain to them that they've got coverage by the ed code, that they're covered, essentially. They say, but our principals still won't let us run that story. And principals beg ignorance. They say, I didn't know that we had a rule like that in California. And so that happens all around the country, it seems to me. And I just had students talk to me about having their papers confiscated, which is another thing that I think is happening as well. There are more demands for prior review, and we see more papers that come out with stories that upset administration for one reason or another. They get confiscated. So those are other impacts that the ruling has had as well. You know, I've never left scholastic journalism. I never will. It was what changed my life in high school, and I've stayed with it through college and now throughout my career. So I still work with the Journalism Education Association's mentor program. After I left the classroom in 2000, I began working as a mentor teacher, and that was sort of another career for me. So I mentored and then trained people to be mentors through 2008. But since then, I've worked exclusively with JEA on the mentor program.
Wayne Dunn, and in January of 1988, I was instructing English and journalism at Lebanon High School in Lebanon, Ohio. I had been advising roughly about 4 years at that point, I think. So I was a fairly new advisor, but I was keyed into the decision because of all the talk and what was going on. But there was always an attempt, because they viewed the press suspiciously. They were fearful of what might happen if stories got out or were reported. And afterward, it got only worse. At that point, the principal said, no, I have a right to see that. But he didn't tell me that. He told my editor-in-chief. He said, no, you have to show me that. And I said, you have to take care of this, to the editor-in-chief. And he walked in and said, we don't have to show that to you. And the principal said, well, yes, I do. The Supreme Court just said that you have to let me prior review. And he was well versed in law at that time, and he said, no, we don't. We're an open forum, so we're a student-run publication, and we can control the content, therefore we don't fall under Hazelwood. And the principal got very angry with him and said, you can't talk to me like that. That's not right. You don't know. You know, you're just a kid. And Dennis handed our principal a card and said, here's a lawyer, you can call him and ask him, and he'll tell you that if we're a public forum, we don't fall under your thing. So I'm going to check with my own lawyer. And as he came back a day later and said, you were right, but we'll change that. So he tried to put it into the handbook, for the student handbook, that the newspaper was a student publication. And the students tried to just ignore that and run around and still go as a public forum and allow everything else, so that if it ever came to a head, it would have been kind of iffy, but at least that was the way they handled it. Now, Georgia and I, my wife, travel around the state and work with, we mentor young journalism advisors. That was awkward, wasn't it? We mentor journalism advisors who are just starting out. How about that? And our role is to work with them, and sometimes with their staffs, depending upon the situation, to try to foster them along and help them know that there's somebody out there that's looking out for them. They're not alone in the process. I think it definitely has. Principals after that point were taught in law classes from the principals I talked to, that Hazelwood meant they needed to censor instead of that they could under certain circumstances. That part wasn't being taught to them. It was that it's a student-run publication, you're responsible for it, you better get in there and see what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to be liable for what's said. And that's just wrong and not a good learning experience either way.